The desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust as Marcus Thompson adjusted his position behind the rock formation. His military uniform, now faded and torn from 3 days in the wilderness, clung to his sweat-soaked skin. The Apache war party had been tracking him since dawn, and his ammunition was running dangerously low. At 26, Marcus had survived 2 tours of duty, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when 3 young Apache girls would change his life forever. The ambush had come without warning. Marcus's patrol unit had been escorting supplies through the canyon when the attack began. Arrows whistled through the air like deadly whispers, and the thunderous war cries echoed off the canyon walls. Within minutes, his entire unit was scattered or dead. Marcus had grabbed what supplies he could carry and fled deeper into the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona Territory. Now, as the sun reached its merciless peak, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. Not the war cries of warriors, but the terrified screams of children. Through a gap in the rocks, he spotted them, 3 Apache girls, none older than 12, huddled together on a narrow ledge about 50 feet below. They had been separated from their people during what appeared to be a rival tribal conflict, not the same group that had attacked his patrol. The girls were in immediate danger. The ledge they clung to was crumbling, and below them yawned a deadly drop into a rocky ravine. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 8, was crying softly while the oldest tried to comfort her 2 companions. Their traditional dresses were torn, and Marcus could see scratches and bruises covering their small arms and legs. Marcus knew he should keep moving. Every minute he stayed increased his chances of being found by the warriors still hunting him. His training told him to prioritize his own survival. But, as he watched the 3 girls, something deeper than military protocol stirred within him. These children were innocent victims caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't understand. The decision came to him with startling clarity. Marcus began removing his gear, keeping only his knife and a length of rope. The girls had noticed him now, and their frightened eyes followed his every movement. The oldest girl spoke sharply to her companions in Apache, probably warning them about the white soldier above them. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus called down softly, though he knew they likely didn't understand English. He held up his hands to show he was unarmed, then pointed to the rope. The universal language of desperate need seemed to bridge the gap between them. The youngest girl's foot slipped suddenly, sending rocks cascading into the abyss below. Her terrified shriek pierced the desert air as she dangled from the crumbling ledge, held only by her sister's trembling grip. Marcus didn't hesitate. He secured the rope around a sturdy boulder and began his descent. The Apache girls watched in amazement as the enemy soldier risked his life to reach them. Cultural boundaries seemed meaningless in the face of their shared humanity. As Marcus carefully made his way down the treacherous rock face, he could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats. The warriors were getting closer. When Marcus reached the ledge, he found it even more precarious than it had appeared from above. The rock was soft and weathered, ready to give way at any moment. The 3 girls pressed themselves against the cliff wall, uncertain whether to trust this unexpected rescuer. The oldest girl, whom Marcus would later learn was called Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, studied his face intently. Despite her youth, her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much violence. She seemed to make a decision, speaking rapidly to her younger companions before turning back to Marcus with a nod. Marcus worked quickly, using his knife to cut the rope into sections. He fashioned makeshift harnesses for each girl, testing the knots carefully. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Marcus knew they had minutes at most before being discovered. "Listen to me," he said gently, looking into each girl's eyes. "I need you to trust me completely. We're going to climb together, but you must do exactly as I show you." Though they couldn't understand his words, the girls seemed to grasp his meaning. Ayana translated for her companions, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her expression. The middle child, about 10 years old, nodded bravely. But the youngest, barely more than a baby, trembled uncontrollably. Marcus began with Ayana, showing her how to grip the rope and where to place her feet on the rock face. She was surprisingly strong and agile, adapting quickly to his instructions. The middle child, whom he would learn was called Kaya, meaning little sister, followed Ayana's example with determination that belied her years. The youngest, Satali, meaning star, was too frightened and weak to climb on her own. Marcus made a difficult decision. He secured her to his back with a section of rope, feeling her tiny arms lock around his neck in desperate trust. The added weight would make the climb exponentially more dangerous, but leaving her behind was not an option. As they began their ascent, the sound of hoofbeats suddenly stopped. Marcus's heart pounded as he realized the warriors had found their trail. Voices carried on the desert wind, speaking in rapid Apache. They were searching the area, and it would only be moments before they discovered the rope. Halfway up the cliff face, Kaya's foot slipped. She swung wildly, scraping against the rough rock as she fought to regain her footing. Her frightened whimper seemed to echo forever in the silence. Marcus reached over, steadying her with one hand while maintaining his grip with the other. Little Satali's hold around his neck tightened almost to the point of choking him. "Stay calm," Marcus whispered, though sweat poured down his face from the exertion and fear. "We're almost there." Ayana had reached the top and was pulling herself over the edge when the first warrior appeared at the base of the cliff. His war cry of discovery sent chills through everyone on the rock face. More voices joined his, and Marcus knew they had been found. An arrow struck the rock just inches from Marcus's hand, sending stone chips flying. Satali whimpered against his ear, and he could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. Kaya was still several feet below, frozen with terror as more arrows began to fly around them. "Climb!" Marcus shouted to Kaya. "Don't look down, just climb." Ayana, now safe at the top, was calling encouragement to her companions in Apache. Her voice carried a strength that seemed to give the others courage. Kaya found her footing again and began climbing with renewed determination. Another arrow whistled past Marcus's head, so close he felt the fletching brush his hair. The warriors below were skilled archers, but the angle and distance made accurate shooting difficult. Still, it was only a matter of time before one found its mark. Marcus's arms burned with the effort of supporting both his own weight and Satali's. His muscles screamed for relief, but he forced himself to keep climbing. Every handhold could be his last if his strength gave out. Kaya reached the top just as Marcus felt his grip beginning to slip. His right hand was cramping, and his left was bleeding from scraping against the sharp rock. Satali's weight seemed to double with each passing second. But, as he looked up and saw all three girls safely at the top, their faces filled with concern for his welfare, Marcus found reserves of strength he didn't know existed. The final few feet of the climb were a blur of pain and determination. Marcus's vision began to tunnel from exhaustion, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Just when he thought he couldn't pull himself up another inch, he felt small hands grasping his arms. All three girls were helping pull him over the edge, their combined strength just enough to assist his final effort. Marcus collapsed on the solid ground, Satali still clinging to his back, as arrows continued to strike the rocks around them. They were safe for the moment, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning of their ordeal. The warriors below would find another way up, and, when they did, there would be nowhere left to run. As he caught his breath and looked at the three girls who had just helped save his life, Marcus made a silent promise that would change everything. He would not let them face whatever came next alone. Somehow, despite the language barrier and the centuries of conflict between their peoples, these three Apache children had become his responsibility. Their markings, the traditional tattoos and paint that identified their clan and family, were now burned into his memory like a sacred trust. Marcus had no way of knowing that this moment, gasping for breath on a clifftop with three frightened children, would become the foundation for a bond stronger than blood. The war between their peoples might continue to rage around them, but, in this small corner of the desert, a different kind of understanding was being born. As the sound of the warriors attempting to scale the cliff reached their ears, Marcus rose to his feet despite his exhaustion. Satali finally released her death grip around his neck, but stayed close beside him. Ayana and Kaya flanked his other side, and, for the first time since the rescue began, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months of warfare. He felt hope. The three girls looked up at him with expressions that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. In their eyes, he was no longer an enemy soldier. He was their protector, their unlikely guardian in a world gone mad with violence. And, in that moment, Marcus understood that his own life had found a new purpose. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they would face together, he would not let go of this sacred trust. The Apache girls' markings would indeed become his lifeline, connecting him not just to their survival, but to his own humanity in the midst of unthinkable cruelty. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying new challenges on its dusty breath, but it also carried the promise of an extraordinary journey that would test every assumption about loyalty, family, and the true meaning of courage. The pursuit began immediately. Marcus could hear the warriors finding alternate routes up the cliff face, their voices growing closer with each passing minute. He gathered the 3 girls around him, studying their faces in the harsh afternoon sun. Ayana, the oldest, had stopped trembling and now watched him with calculating eyes. She understood their situation better than her younger companions. "We need to move," Marcus said, gesturing toward the desert expanse ahead of them. "Fast." But, as they began to run, Marcus realized the girls were struggling. They were barefoot, their feet already cut and bruised from their earlier ordeal. The desert floor was littered with sharp stones and thorny plants that would shred their skin within minutes. Without hesitation, Marcus sat down and began unlacing his military boots. Ayana shook her head vigorously when she understood his intention. She spoke rapidly in Apache, clearly protesting his sacrifice. But Marcus ignored her objections, pulling off his thick socks as well. He gestured for the girls to sit, then began the delicate process of fitting his large boots and socks onto their small feet. The boots were far too big, but Marcus used strips torn from his shirt to secure them. Ayana got the boots, while Kaya and Satali shared his socks, which came up to their knees like protective stockings. It wasn't perfect, but it would allow them to move across the rough terrain. Now barefoot himself, Marcus felt every sharp stone and thorn as they resumed their flight. Blood soon stained the ground behind them, but he pushed forward without complaint. The girls noticed his sacrifice immediately. Satali, the youngest, kept looking back at his bloody feet with wide, concerned eyes. They ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. Marcus's lungs burned in the thin, hot air, and he could see the girls were reaching their limits. Kaya stumbled frequently, and Satali's pace had slowed to barely more than a walk. They needed shelter, and they needed it soon. The landscape around them was unforgiving, endless stretches of scrub brush and cacti with little in the way of cover. But Marcus's military training had taught him to see opportunities in the most unlikely places. In the distance, he spotted what looked like a dry riverbed cutting through the desert floor. As they approached the wash, Marcus discovered it was deeper than it had appeared from a distance. The banks were about 8 feet high, carved from red clay and stoned by flash floods over countless years. More importantly, there were small caves and overhangs carved into the sides, natural shelters that could hide them from their pursuers. Marcus chose a cave that was partially concealed by an overhang of rock and thorny brush. It was barely large enough for the 4 of them, but it would have to do. As they crawled inside, Marcus noticed the girls studying the walls with intense interest. The cave was covered in ancient petroglyphs, pictures and symbols carved into the rock by Apache ancestors centuries ago. Ayana traced one of the symbols with her finger, her expression softening for the first time since Marcus had met her. She spoke softly to her companions, and they gathered around the carved images with something approaching reverence. Marcus realized this was no ordinary hiding place. This was a sacred site, a place where Apache people had sought shelter and left their stories for future generations. The irony wasn't lost on him, an enemy soldier seeking refuge in a place holy to the very people who were hunting him. Ayana seemed to understand the significance as well. She looked at Marcus with new eyes, as if seeing him differently now that he had brought them to this sacred space. She spoke a few words in Apache, her tone serious and formal. Though Marcus couldn't understand the language, something in her voice suggested she was making a kind of declaration or promise. As they huddled in the small cave, listening for sounds of pursuit, Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something profound. The 3 girls began to sing, their voices barely above a whisper. The melody was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. It seemed to come from the very walls around them, as if the ancient spirits carved in stone were joining their voices. little Satali fell asleep during the song, curled up against Marcus's side like a trusting child. Her small hand clutched a piece of his torn shirt, and her breathing gradually became deep and regular. Marcus found himself moved by her complete trust in him, the stranger who had appeared in her darkest moment. Kaya, the middle child, had been studying Marcus's face while they rested. Suddenly, she reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out what looked like charcoal mixed with red clay. Before Marcus could react, she began drawing on his forehead and cheeks, her small fingers surprisingly steady as she worked. Ayana watched this process with intense attention, occasionally murmuring what sounded like instructions. Marcus sat perfectly still, understanding somehow that this was deeply important, though he had no idea what was happening to him. When Kaya finished her work, she sat back with a satisfied expression. Ayana nodded approvingly, then took the paint from her sister and added a few final touches around Marcus's eyes. The youngest, Satali, had awakened during the process and was watching with fascination. Marcus reached up to touch his face, but Ayana gently caught his hand and shook her head. She pointed to a small pool of standing water in the corner of the cave, then made gestures indicating he should look at his reflection. What Marcus saw in the dark water shocked him to his core. The girls had painted traditional Apache markings on his face, not the war paint he had expected, but something else entirely. The designs were intricate and meaningful, clearly following patterns that had been passed down through generations. Ayana spoke slowly, pointing to various parts of the markings and repeating words in Apache. Though Marcus couldn't understand the language, he began to grasp that she was explaining the meaning of each symbol. The pattern around his eyes seemed to indicate protection or guardianship. The lines on his forehead suggested strength and courage. But it was the marking over his heart, painted in red clay, that seemed most significant. When Ayana saw Marcus touching this central symbol, she placed her small hand over his and spoke a single word, family. The weight of what had just happened hit Marcus like a physical blow. These three Apache girls had just performed some kind of adoption ceremony, marking him as one of their own. The enemy soldier who had risked his life to save them was now, in their eyes, their brother and protector. Marcus looked at each girl in turn, seeing them differently now that he understood what they had done. Ayana, with her wise eyes and steady presence, was clearly the leader despite her youth. Kaya, creative and intuitive, had been the one to initiate this sacred ritual. And little Satali, trusting and innocent, had accepted him completely from the moment he had carried her up the cliff. Outside the cave, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the riverbed. The warriors had found their trail and were searching the area. Marcus gestured for the girls to stay quiet, but he could see they were all thinking the same thing. If they were discovered now, the sacred markings on his face would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by both sides. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Marcus could hear voices calling to each other as the warriors spread out to search every potential hiding place. He pressed deeper into the cave, sheltering the three girls behind his body. If the warriors found them, he would try to convince them that he was holding the girls hostage, hoping to protect them from punishment for accepting him into their spiritual family. But, as the voices grew louder, Marcus realized something had changed in the girls' behavior. They were no longer afraid in the same way they had been before. The sacred ceremony seemed to have given them a new kind of strength, a confidence that came from belonging to something larger than themselves. Ayana crept to the edge of the cave and listened intently to the voices outside. Her expression was thoughtful, almost calculating. She turned back to Marcus and whispered something urgent in Apache, then pointed to herself and her sisters. Marcus didn't understand her words, but her meaning became clear when she began removing the makeshift footwear he had fashioned for them. She was preparing to go outside, to face the warriors searching for them. Marcus shook his head firmly, but Ayana's expression was determined. She spoke more urgently now, and Marcus began to understand that she had a plan. The girls would surrender themselves to the warriors, claiming they had escaped on their own after being captured by white soldiers. Marcus would remain hidden until the search moved on, then try to make his way to safety. It was a logical plan, and it would probably work. But, as Marcus looked at the three girls who had just claimed him as family, he knew he couldn't let them face their uncertain fate alone. The markings on his face were still damp, and he could feel their symbolic weight like a physical presence. No, he said firmly, surprising himself with the resolve in his voice. We stay together. Ayana studied his face, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. She had been testing him, he realized. Testing whether the white soldier would abandon them when their presence became inconvenient. His refusal to let them sacrifice themselves for his safety had apparently passed whatever test she had devised. The voices outside were moving away now, the search expanding to other areas of the riverbed. But Marcus knew they would be back, and next time they might search more thoroughly. They needed a better plan, one that would keep all four of them together and safe. As if reading his thoughts, Ayana began sketching in the sandy floor of the cave. She drew what looked like a map, showing the riverbed, the surrounding hills, and several other landmarks. She pointed to various spots on the map, speaking in Apache and gesturing animatedly. Marcus studied her crude drawing, beginning to understand that she was showing him safe places her people used when traveling through this territory. Hidden water sources, shelter caves, and paths that avoided the main routes used by both Apache and white military patrols. The realization struck him with surprising force: these three young girls knew this desert better than any map in the U.S. Army could show. They were his guides now, not his burden. The sacred markings on his face weren't just ceremonial, they were practical, marking him as someone under their protection just as much as he was protecting them. As night began to fall outside their shelter, Marcus understood that everything had changed. He was no longer a lone soldier trying to survive in hostile territory. He was part of a family now, bound by markings that carried more weight than any military rank or national allegiance. The three Apache girls had given him something more valuable than safe passage through the desert. They had given him a new identity, a purpose beyond mere survival. And, as he felt the clay markings drying on his skin, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he would never let them down. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The markings had become his lifeline in more ways than he could have imagined, connecting him not just to these three brave children, but to a heritage and wisdom that had survived in this harsh land for countless generations. Outside the cave, the desert night settled over them with its ancient silence, but, inside their small shelter, a new kind of family had been born from the ashes of conflict and fear. Dawn came with the sound of rain, the first moisture the desert had seen in months. Marcus woke to find water dripping through cracks in the cave ceiling, collecting in small pools around them. The three girls were already awake, their faces brightened by this unexpected blessing. In the Apache tradition, rain was considered a gift from the spirits, and its arrival during their time of greatest need seemed deeply significant. Satali held her cupped hands under one of the larger drips, drinking eagerly. The fresh water was more precious than gold in this harsh environment, and Marcus realized their luck might be changing. But, as he shifted to collect water himself, a sharp pain shot through his left side, causing him to gasp involuntarily. Ayana noticed his distress immediately. She approached him with the careful movements of someone experienced in healing, her young hands surprisingly gentle as she examined his torso. Marcus hadn't realized he'd been injured during their escape, but now he could see a spreading dark stain on his uniform where an arrow had grazed his ribs during the cliff climb. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was infected. In the humid cave, bacteria had found the perfect environment to multiply. Ayana spoke urgently to her sisters, and they sprang into action with the efficiency of a trained medical team. Kaya disappeared into the rain outside, returning minutes later with specific plants Marcus didn't recognize. Satali had found a flat rock that could serve as a grinding surface. Ayana took charge of the makeshift pharmacy, crushing leaves and roots into a paste while explaining each step to Marcus in a mixture of Apache and gestures. Marcus watched in amazement as these three children demonstrated medical knowledge that rivaled anything he'd learned in military field training. They understood which plants fought infection, which numbed pain, and how to combine them for maximum effectiveness. Their small hands worked with the confidence of generations of inherited wisdom. When Ayana applied the herbal paste to his wound, Marcus felt immediate relief from the burning pain. She tore strips from her own dress to create bandages, ignoring Marcus's protests about damaging her clothing. The look in her eyes made it clear that his well-being was now their responsibility, just as their safety was his. The rain continued throughout the morning, turning their desert refuge into a temporary oasis. water collected in natural basins, and the girls showed Marcus how to identify edible cactus fruits and roots that the moisture had made easier to harvest. What had seemed like barren wasteland revealed itself to be rich with resources, if you knew how to find them. But their peaceful respite was shattered when Kaya returned from a scouting trip with disturbing news. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her expression grim as she pointed toward the mouth of the cave. Ayana translated with gestures and the few English words she was beginning to pick up from Marcus. A large group of Apache warriors had set up camp less than a mile away. But these weren't the same men who had been pursuing them. These were from a different clan, and, according to Kaya's observations, they were preparing for something significant, a gathering that involved multiple tribal groups. Marcus's military experience told him this could only mean one thing: a major coordinated attack was being planned. The various Apache clans were uniting for a massive assault, probably against the nearby army fort where his regiment was stationed. His fellow soldiers were walking into a trap, and they had no idea what was coming. The ethical dilemma tore at Marcus's conscience. His loyalty to his military brothers demanded that he find a way to warn the fort. But revealing himself to deliver that warning would almost certainly mean death for him and probably punishment for the 3 girls who had sheltered him. The sacred markings on his face would be seen as evidence of treason by both sides. Ayana seemed to sense his internal struggle. She had been watching his face carefully as the implications became clear to him. With her characteristic wisdom, she began speaking softly in Apache, her tone suggesting she was explaining something important to her sisters. Satali looked confused by the conversation, but Kaya's expression grew thoughtful. She studied Marcus's face, then asked him something in Apache that he didn't understand. When he looked puzzled, she tried to communicate through gestures, pointing to his uniform, then to herself and her sisters, then making motions that seemed to indicate choice or decision. Marcus realized she was asking him to choose his duty to his soldiers or his loyalty to his new family. It was an impossible decision, one that would haunt him regardless of what he chose. But, as he looked at these 3 brave children who had risked everything to save his life and welcome him as family, Marcus understood that some bonds transcended the artificial divisions created by war. However, Ayana surprised him by reaching a different conclusion. She stood up with sudden determination and began gathering their few possessions. She spoke firmly to her sisters, her tone brooking no argument. Both younger girls nodded solemnly, though Satali's eyes filled with tears. Through gestures and her growing English vocabulary, Ayana made her intentions clear. She was going to help Marcus save his fellow soldiers, even though it meant putting their own lives at risk. The sacred markings they had placed on his face didn't just make him their brother, they made his people their people, extending their protection to his entire clan. Marcus was overwhelmed by the magnitude of her decision. These 3 Apache girls were willing to betray their own people's war plans to save the lives of enemy soldiers, all because they had claimed Marcus as family. The depth of loyalty represented by their choice humbled him beyond words. But Ayana wasn't finished surprising him. She produced a small object from her pouch, a piece of carved bone decorated with intricate symbols. She pressed it into Marcus's hand, speaking urgently in Apache while pointing toward the direction of the fort. Marcus didn't need translation to understand this was some kind of safe passage token, a symbol that would be recognized by Apache scouts and warriors. Ayana was giving him the means to travel safely through territory controlled by her people, at least until he reached the boundaries of his own military's patrol area. The plan that emerged from their desperate consultation was both brilliant and dangerous. Marcus would make his way to the fort to warn of the impending attack, carrying Ayana's bone token for protection. The 3 girls would remain hidden in the cave until the military crisis passed, then attempt to rejoin their own people. But, as they prepared to implement this plan, Satali made a decision that changed everything. The youngest girl, who had barely spoken throughout their ordeal, suddenly stood up and walked to Marcus. She reached up and touched the markings on his face, her small fingers tracing the symbols her sisters had painted there. Then, she spoke, her voice clear and determined despite her youth. She said only one word, but it was in English: family. Satali had been listening more carefully than anyone realized. She understood more of their conversation than she had let on, and she had made her own choice. She would not let Marcus face the dangers ahead alone. Ayana tried to dissuade her youngest sister, but Satali's mind was made up. She began preparing for travel, gathering the makeshift footwear and water containers with the determination of someone far older than her 8 years. Kaya, not to be left behind, announced her own decision to join the mission. She pointed out that Marcus would need guides who knew the secret paths through Apache territory, and that her knowledge of plant medicines might be essential if his wound reopened during the difficult journey ahead. Marcus found himself facing a new dilemma. Taking 3 Apache children directly into a military fort during wartime seemed like madness. They would be seen as enemy spies or hostages, and their safety could never be guaranteed. But the girls had already decided, and their determination was absolute. Ayana solved the problem with characteristic insight. She explained through gestures that they wouldn't enter the fort itself. Instead, they would guide Marcus to within sight of the military compound, then wait in a predetermined location while he delivered his warning. If he didn't return within a certain time, they would assume he had been killed or captured and make their own way back to their people. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, Marcus took a final look around the cave that had sheltered them. The ancient petroglyphs seemed to watch over their departure, silent witnesses to the extraordinary bond that had formed between these unlikely companions. The rain had stopped, but the desert air still carried moisture that made breathing easier. Marcus's wound felt much better thanks to the girls' herbal treatment, and their makeshift medical supplies were carefully packed for the journey ahead. Before leaving the cave, Ayana performed a brief ceremony, speaking words in Apache while touching each of the ancient symbols carved into the walls. She was asking for the protection of her ancestors, seeking their blessing for the dangerous mission they were about to undertake. Marcus understood that this moment marked a turning point not just in their immediate circumstances, but in the larger story of conflict between their peoples. For individuals, 1 white soldier and 3 Apache children were about to risk everything to bridge a gap that governments and armies had declared unbridgeable. As they emerged into the desert morning, Marcus felt the weight of the bone token in his pocket and the dried clay markings on his face. These physical symbols of his adopted family status would either save his life or seal his fate. But, more importantly, they represented something revolutionary, the possibility that loyalty and love could transcend the boundaries of race and nationality. The 3 girls fell into formation around him with military precision, despite their youth. Ayana took point as the leader and primary navigator. Kaya positioned herself to watch for dangers from the flanks, while little Satali stayed close to Marcus as their communications link and morale officer. They moved across the landscape like a family unit that had been working together for years rather than days. The girls' knowledge of the terrain was extraordinary, leading Marcus along paths he never would have discovered on his own. They avoided main trails and open areas, instead following dry creek beds and hidden valleys that provided both cover and faster travel. As they traveled, Marcus began to understand that he was receiving an education in desert survival that no military manual could provide. The girls showed him how to read the landscape for signs of water, how to identify which plants were safe to eat, and how to move across different types of terrain without leaving obvious tracks. But, more than practical knowledge, they were teaching him about courage in its purest form. These 3 children were walking directly into danger for the sake of people they had never met, guided only by their understanding that family obligations extended beyond blood relations to encompass anyone who had proven themselves worthy of trust and protection. The sun climbed higher as they made their way toward an uncertain destiny, but Marcus had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Whatever happened when they reached the fort, whatever consequences awaited them all, he would not let go of the sacred trust these 3 Apache girls had placed in him. Their markings had indeed become his lifeline, connecting him to a strength and purpose he never knew existed. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but they would face it together, bound by bonds stronger than any army could forge or any war could break. The military fort appeared in the distance like a brown smudge against the desert horizon, its wooden walls and guard towers stark against the endless sky. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as they approached the place that had been home for the past 2 years. But, now, marked with Apache symbols and accompanied by 3 children from the enemy tribe, he was returning as someone fundamentally changed. The girls had led him through a maze of hidden canyons and secret paths, avoiding the main approaches to the fort where army patrols would be expecting Apache attacks. Their knowledge of the terrain was so complete that Marcus realized they had probably observed military movements for months, perhaps years, without being detected. As they crested the final ridge that overlooked the fort, Marcus could see the normal patterns of daily life continuing below. Soldiers moved between buildings, horses grazed in the corral, and smoke rose from the mess hall chimney. His fellow soldiers had no idea that hundreds of Apache warriors were gathering less than 20 miles away, preparing for a coordinated assault that could overrun the fort's defenses. Ayanna studied the military compound through eyes that had been trained to assess tactical situations despite her youth. She pointed out details that Marcus, even with his military experience, had never noticed: blind spots in the guard tower positions, weaknesses in the wall construction, patterns in the patrol schedules that could be exploited by attacking forces. Her tactical assessment was both impressive and terrifying. If a 12-year-old Apache girl could identify these vulnerabilities so easily, what chance did the fort have against experienced warriors who had been planning this attack for weeks? The three girls established their hiding place in a cluster of large boulders about half a mile from the fort's main gate. The position provided excellent concealment while maintaining visual contact with the military compound. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes if their presence was discovered. Before Marcus left them to approach the fort alone, Ayanna performed one final ritual. She mixed fresh paint from clay and plant dyes, carefully refreshing the markings on his face that had faded during their journey. Her touch was gentle but deliberate, and Marcus understood that she was renewing the spiritual protection that would guide him through the dangerous hours ahead. Kaya contributed her own blessing, pressing a small pouch of medicinal herbs into his hands. The mixture would help him stay alert and strong during what was likely to be a very long and difficult day. Little Satali simply hugged him tightly, her small arms conveying more love and trust than any words could express. As Marcus walked away from his adopted family toward the fort where his birth family of soldiers waited, he felt like he was walking between two worlds. The Apache markings on his face declared his loyalty to one set of values, while his uniform represented completely different allegiances. Somehow, he would have to find a way to honor both. The first challenge came at the fort's main gate, where 2 sentries Marcus had known for months stared at him in shock. His appearance was startling: uniform torn and stained, face painted with Apache symbols, bare feet bloody from days of desert travel. To the guards, he looked like either an escaped prisoner who had been tortured, or a traitor who had joined the enemy. "Halt!" Sergeant Patterson called out, raising his rifle. "Identify yourself." "It's me, Patterson," Marcus replied, keeping his hands visible and moving slowly. "Marcus Thompson, 3rd Cavalry. I need to speak with the colonel immediately." Patterson's eyes narrowed as he studied the markings on Marcus's face. "What happened to you, Thompson? And what's that paint doing on your face?" "It's complicated," Marcus said. "But I have intelligence about an imminent Apache attack. The colonel needs to hear this right now." The second guard, Private Johnson, had been staring at Marcus with growing suspicion. "How do we know you're really Thompson? How do we know this isn't some Apache trick?" Marcus understood their caution. In frontier warfare, deception was common, and his appearance would raise red flags for any competent sentry. But time was running out, the attack could begin at any moment. "Johnson, remember when you first arrived at the fort and accidentally discharged your rifle during morning inspection? I covered for you so you wouldn't face court-martial charges. Patterson, you've got a scar on your left shoulder from a knife fight in Tucson before you enlisted. Only someone who's lived with you men would know those details." The 2 guards exchanged glances, their suspicion beginning to fade. Marcus's knowledge of personal details convinced them of his identity, but they were still confused by his appearance. "Those markings on your face," Patterson said slowly. "Those are Apache symbols. How did they get there?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would determine whether he was treated as a returning hero or an enemy collaborator. "I was saved by 3 Apache children. They marked me as family. Those marks are the reason I'm alive to warn you about what's coming." The guards escorted Marcus directly to Colonel Harrison's office, where his appearance created an immediate sensation. Officers who had known Marcus for years stared in disbelief at the transformation that had occurred during his 5 days in the desert. Colonel Harrison, a veteran of 20 years of Indian warfare, studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of a man who had seen every possible variation of frontier deception. "Sergeant Thompson, you look like hell. And you're wearing Apache paint. Start talking." Marcus delivered his report with military precision, describing the ambush that had destroyed his patrol, his escape into the desert, and, most importantly, the large gathering of Apache warriors preparing for a coordinated attack. He provided specific details about numbers, weapons, and timing based on what the girls had observed. But, when the colonel asked how he had obtained this intelligence, Marcus faced his greatest test. He had to explain about the 3 Apache children without revealing their current location or putting them at risk of retaliation. "I was rescued by 3 Apache girls who had been separated from their people," Marcus said carefully. "They provided medical treatment and guided me through territory I never could have crossed alone. In return, I protected them from dangers they couldn't handle by themselves." "And the paint on your face?" Colonel Harrison asked pointedly. "They marked me as family," Marcus replied. "It was a spiritual ceremony, their way of claiming responsibility for my welfare. Those markings are the reason I was able to travel through Apache territory without being killed." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several officers expressed outrage that Marcus had allowed himself to be contaminated by Apache rituals. Others questioned whether his intelligence could be trusted, suggesting that he might have been fed false information as part of an elaborate deception. But Colonel Harrison silenced the debate with a raised hand. His experienced eye had noted details that the other officers missed: the genuine exhaustion in Marcus's face, the fresh scars and healing wounds that told the story of his ordeal, and, most importantly, the quality of intelligence he was providing. "The information is too detailed and specific to be fabricated," the colonel declared. "And Thompson's condition supports his story about surviving in the desert for 5 days. We're going to act on his warning." The fort exploded into activity as preparations for the expected attack began immediately. Ammunition was distributed, defensive positions were reinforced, and messengers were sent to summon additional troops from neighboring outposts. Marcus's intelligence had potentially saved hundreds of lives. But, as the preparations continued, Marcus found himself torn between relief and anxiety. His military family was safe, but what about Ayana, Kaya, and Satali? The 3 Apache girls were hiding less than a mile away, and, when the shooting started, they would be caught in the crossfire between 2 armies. Marcus requested permission to serve in the upcoming battle, but Colonel Harrison denied the request. "You're in no condition to fight, Sergeant. You need medical attention and rest." The colonel's tone softened slightly. "Besides, those markings on your face would cause problems. Our men might not be able to tell you from the enemy in the heat of battle." The medical examination that followed revealed the full extent of Marcus's ordeal. The infected wound in his side was healing well thanks to the Apache herbal treatment, but he was severely dehydrated and malnourished. The fort's doctor was amazed that Marcus had survived at all in the harsh desert conditions. As the medical treatment continued, Marcus learned more details about the impending battle. Scout reports confirmed that large numbers of Apache warriors were indeed moving toward the fort, just as he had warned. The attack would probably begin at dawn the following day, giving the defenders only a few hours to complete their preparations. That night, as Marcus lay in the fort's medical facility, he found himself unable to sleep. Through the small window, he could see the distant ridge where 3 Apache children waited in hiding, probably hungry and frightened as they listened to the sounds of military preparation below. The sacred markings on his face had been washed away during his medical treatment, but Marcus could still feel their spiritual weight. The connection to his Apache family remained strong despite the physical distance. He had kept his promise to warn the fort, but his obligations to Ayana, Kaya, and Satali were far from fulfilled. Around midnight, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He quietly gathered medical supplies and food from the fort stores, then slipped past the distracted sentries who were focused on watching for Apache attackers rather than preventing escapes. The climb up to the hiding place where the girls waited was agonizing with his injured ribs, but Marcus pushed through the pain. He found them huddled together behind the boulders, trying to stay warm in the cold desert night. Their faces lit up with relief and joy when they saw him approaching. Marcus shared the food and medical supplies, but, more importantly, he shared the intelligence that would keep them safe during the coming battle. He used Ayana's crude map-making skills to show them exactly where the fighting would occur and which routes they should use to escape the area before dawn. But, once again, the three girls surprised him with their response. Instead of fleeing to safety, Ayana began asking detailed questions about the fort's defenses and the army's preparations. Her strategic mind was working on some kind of plan, and Marcus could see the wheels turning behind her wise young eyes. When Ayana's intentions became clear, Marcus was stunned. She wanted to help defend the fort. The three Apache children who had risked everything to save the lives of enemy soldiers now wanted to actively participate in protecting them from their own people. Marcus tried to explain why this was impossible. They were children, they had no military training, and, most importantly, they would be shot by both sides if they appeared on the battlefield. But Ayana had thought through all these objections and had answers for each one. The girls wouldn't fight directly, she explained through gestures and broken English. Instead, they would use their knowledge of Apache tactics to help predict and counter the attackers' strategies. They could position themselves to provide intelligence about enemy movements that the army's scouts might miss. Furthermore, Ayana pointed out that the three of them could move through terrain that would be impossible for adult soldiers to traverse. They could serve as messengers and reconnaissance specialists, using their small size and intimate knowledge of the local geography to provide advantages that no military manual could match. As dawn approached and the sounds of the approaching Apache war party grew closer, Marcus found himself making perhaps the most important decision of his life. The three children who had become his family were offering to risk everything once again, this time to protect people they had never met simply because those people were important to him. Standing on that ridge as the first Apache war cries echoed across the desert, Marcus understood that some bonds truly were stronger than blood, stronger than nationality, stronger than the artificial divisions that men created to justify their conflicts. "I won't let go," he said quietly, renewing the promise he had made on the cliff face 5 days earlier. But now the words carried new meaning. He wouldn't let go of his military family, and he wouldn't let go of his Apache family. Somehow, against all odds and military regulations, he would find a way to protect both. The three girls painted fresh markings on his face as the battle began below them, their steady hands working by touch in the pre-dawn darkness. When they finished, Marcus looked like what he had truly become, a bridge between two worlds, a man whose loyalties transcended the boundaries of war. As the sun rose over the desert battlefield, four unlikely allies prepared to write a new chapter in the story of the American frontier, one that would prove that love and loyalty could triumph over hatred and fear. The Apache girls' markings had indeed become Marcus's lifeline, but they had also become something more, a symbol of hope in a world torn apart by conflict. The battle that followed would be remembered in military histories for its strategic brilliance and minimal casualties. But the real victory was quieter and more profound, the victory of 3 Apache children and 1 white soldier who refused to let the divisions of war destroy the bonds of an extraordinary family forged in the crucible of the desert's unforgiving embrace.